Welcome to the Good Book Tales. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and timeless stories ever told, the complete story of Abraham, the father of nations. Before kings and empires rose, before cities filled the deserts, there was a man who dared to believe in a promise that seemed impossible. His name was Abraham, and his journey changed the course of history forever. Imagine a world long before maps, before religions were known by name. A time when people worshipped stone idols and bowed to the sun. In this ancient land of one man heard a voice that no one else could hear, a voice that called him to leave behind everything he knew. His family, his land, his gods, everything. That voice was the voice of the one true God, the God who would make a covenant not just with a man, but with all of humanity through him. Abraham wasn't a warrior, nor a king. He was an ordinary man with extraordinary faith. Yet, what God promised him sounded impossible. I will make you the father of many nations. How could a man with no child, already old in years, become the father of nations? How could he trust a promise so great when his reality showed only emptiness and silence? But this is where Abraham's story begins, in the tension between faith and fear, between promise and impossibility. It's a story of courage, obedience, and the kind of faith that defies reason. Along the way, we'll meet the key figures who shaped his journey. Sarah, his wife, who laughed at the idea of giving birth in her old age. Lot, his nephew, who chose the wealth of Sodom over the path of faith, and even kings and strangers who crossed paths with Abraham, never knowing they were walking beside a man chosen by God. Abraham's story isn't just about one man's belief. It's about the foundation of three major faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all tracing their roots back to this one man who dared to believe. His life became the blueprint of trust in divine promise, a journey of sacrifice, hope, and unshakable faith. But behind the glory lies pain, waiting, and unimaginable tests. There were nights when Abraham looked up at the sky, counting stars he could never number, wondering if the voice he heard was real. There were moments when every step forward felt like walking into darkness. And just when the promise seemed within reach, the greatest test of all would come. A test so heartbreaking that it would echo through generations. As the flames of faith and fear burn together, we ask, how far can a man go to prove his trust in God? And what happens when the very promise he's waited for is the one he's asked to give up? Stay with me, because this is just the beginning. The story of Abraham, the father of nations, is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. Abraham's story begins in the city of a place filled with noise, trade, and idols carved from stone. The air was thick with incense, and people prayed to gods made by human hands, gods that could not speak or hear. Yet, in that very world of confusion, one man listened for something different. Deep inside, Abraham felt a quiet stirring, a whisper that seemed to come from beyond the sky. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't a dream. It was a voice, calm, clear, and unlike anything he had ever known. That voice called him by name and asked him to do the unthinkable, to leave his home, his family, and everything familiar, and go to a land that God would show him. Imagine that moment. Abraham, standing under the stars, hearing a divine call that made no sense to anyone else. His neighbors might have laughed, and his family might have thought he was losing his mind. But something in that voice carried a power that cut through fear. It spoke of promise, of a future so vast that even the stars could not number it. I will bless you, the voice said, and through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Those words would echo through generations, becoming one of the most powerful promises in human history. With his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, Abraham gathered what little he had and began a journey into the unknown. Every mile he walked took him farther from comfort, deeper into faith. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, and the nights grew colder. There were no maps, no directions, only trust. Each step tested him. Was the promise real? Would God truly make him the father of nations? But the road of faith is never straight. As Abraham moved from place to place, the land seemed both beautiful and harsh. Hunger, drought, and fear followed him. There were moments when he doubted, when he wondered if he had misunderstood the call. Sarah too wrestled with disbelief. How could she, a woman far beyond childbearing age, become the mother of a great people? Yet, even in their doubt, they kept moving forward. And as they traveled, unseen forces began to stir. Kings who would envy Abraham's blessings, strangers who would test his integrity, and trials that would push his faith to its breaking point. The promise of becoming the father of nations was real, but the path toward it was about to grow darker than ever before. Because the greatest blessings often come after the hardest tests, and Abraham's test had only just begun. As Abraham journeyed farther from the land he once called home, the promise that had once sounded so bright began to feel distant. The desert winds whispered doubt, and the endless miles of sand tested both his strength and his faith. The voice that once spoke so clearly was now silent. Every sunrise brought questions. Had he made a mistake? Had he misunderstood what God wanted from him? Sarah watched him closely, her eyes filled with both love and uncertainty. She had followed him without hesitation, but now the years were passing, and still, there was no child. The promise of becoming the father and mother of nations seemed to fade like the horizon they could never reach. In their camp, the tension grew quietly. Lot, Abraham's nephew, was young, ambitious, and drawn to the wealth of the lands they passed through. When their flocks became too large to stay together, conflict began to brew among their herders. Abraham, tired of strife, let Lot choose where to go. Lot looked toward the fertile lands near Sodom, green and rich, while Abraham stayed in the barren hills. It was a choice that seemed wise at first, but one that would later lead to danger and heartbreak. Nights were long, and silence felt heavy. Sarah's heart broke each time she thought about the child she could not have. In that pain, a new idea began to form, one that would change everything. Perhaps, she thought, the promise could come through another. It was a desperate thought, born from years of waiting, but it carried the weight of human impatience. And so, as faith wrestled with doubt and trust battled time, the cracks in the promise began to show. Abraham's journey was far from over, and the real test of his heart was yet to begin. Years passed, and the promise still hung in the air like a shadow that followed Abraham everywhere he went. The world around him changed, kingdoms rose, wars broke out, and his name began to be known. Yet, inside his tent, the silence between him and Sarah grew heavier. Every night, they looked at the stars, the very ones God had once used as a symbol of hope, and each time, the stars seemed more distant. Then, when Abraham was almost 100 years old, something happened that no one expected. The promise stirred back to life. The voice that had once called him in Ur spoke again, renewing the covenant and giving Abraham a new name, a new identity, and a renewed faith. But the joy came with unease, for promises often come wrapped in trials. When Sarah finally gave birth to their son, Isaac, laughter filled their home for the first time in decades. It was the moment they had dreamed of, the fulfillment of years of waiting. But peace never lasts long in the life of those chosen for great purposes. The boy grew, and with him came a new kind of fear, the fear of losing what was finally given. Abraham's faith had brought him far, but now it would be pushed to its limits. One quiet morning, as the lights spread over the hills, Abraham heard that familiar voice once again. But this time, it didn't speak of blessings. It spoke of sacrifice. The words struck like lightning, leaving Abraham trembling in silence. His heart pounded as he tried to understand what was being asked of him. Could this truly be the same God who had promised life and nations through his son? The world seemed to hold its breath as Abraham faced the hardest command of his life, a test that would reveal the deepest truth of faith and love. The morning after the divine command, Abraham sat in silence. The fire from the night before had burned to ash, but its smoke still lingered in the air, curling into the cold dawn. Isaac slept peacefully nearby, unaware of the storm that had entered his father's heart. Every breath Abraham took felt heavy. Every thought battled between love and obedience. This was no ordinary test. This was the breaking point of faith. He had waited a lifetime for his son, the promised child through whom nations would rise. And now the same voice that had given him everything was asking for the unthinkable. Abraham did not speak a word to Sarah that morning. The weight of the command was too great to share. He simply gathered wood, prepared the donkey, and called Isaac to walk with him. As they set out, The world around them felt painfully quiet. No wind, no birds, only the sound of their footsteps on the dusty ground. Isaac carried the wood on his back, the same way Abraham carried the burden in his soul. The boy looked up at his father, confusion in his eyes. "Father," he asked softly, "we have the fire and the wood, but where is the offering?" The question cut through Abraham's heart like a blade. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said only, "God himself will provide." But the journey didn't just test Abraham's faith, it exposed every hidden fear. What if he misunderstood again? What if this time, obedience would cost him everything? Each step closer to the mountain felt like a step deeper into the unknown. Behind them, Sarah waited, unaware of what was unfolding. The servants who traveled part of the way with them looked on in silence, sensing something sacred and sorrowful about the journey, but daring not to ask. And just as the mountain came into view, the sky began to darken. The air grew still, almost too still, as if creation itself was watching. Abraham's heart pounded louder than his footsteps. The place where heaven and earth would meet was now before him, a place where promise and sacrifice would collide. Yet deep inside, a quiet question rose that he couldn't silence. Could faith truly demand the very thing it once promised? The answer was waiting at the top of the mountain, but the climb had only just begun. The climb up the mountain felt endless. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, slow and heavy, as Abraham and Isaac made their way to the place of sacrifice. The sky above them had turned a pale gold, and the air was still. Isaac followed quietly, trusting his father completely, unaware of the weight that pressed against Abraham's soul. When they finally reached the top, Abraham built an altar with trembling hands. Every stone he placed seemed to carry a memory. The first time he heard God's promise, the birth of Isaac, the laughter of Sarah. Now, all of that stood before him, ready to be tested one last time. He arranged the wood carefully, his heart breaking with every movement. Isaac, curious and innocent, helped his father without question. But then came the moment when Abraham could no longer hide the truth. The silence between them was sharp and painful. Isaac's eyes widened, and in them, Abraham saw not fear, but a deep, trusting sadness. He didn't resist, he didn't run. That trust pierced Abraham's heart more deeply than any blade ever could. As he raised his hands toward heaven, time seemed to stop. The air thickened, and everything around him blurred. The promise, the years of waiting, the faith that had carried him this far, all hung in a single moment. Then, just as he was about to take the final step of obedience, a voice broke through the silence. It was the same voice that had called him from You Are, the same voice that had promised life. "Abraham, stop." The words shook the air. "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Tears streamed down Abraham's face as he fell to his knees. Nearby, caught in a thicket, was a ram, the true offering God had provided. Relief flooded through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. The test was never about loss, it was about faith. Abraham had proved that his trust in God was greater than his fear. But as the fire burned and smoke rose toward the sky, Abraham looked at Isaac and saw something new in his eyes, a quiet understanding, a strength that would one day carry the promise forward. Yet in that moment of joy, another mystery began to stir in Abraham's heart. The promise had been saved, but something deeper had been revealed, a hint that this story was only the beginning of something far greater, something that would echo through generations yet to come. As the smoke from the altar rose into the sky, the mountain grew quiet again. Abraham and Isaac stood side by side, their hearts still racing, but filled now with a peace they had never known before. The ram had been offered, the test was over, and the promise was safe. Abraham knew then that this moment would forever mark the bond between him and God, a bond built not on words, but on absolute trust. The same God who had called him from his homeland, who had led him through deserts and doubts, had now proven that his promises were real and everlasting. When Abraham and Isaac walked back down the mountain, their steps were slower, steadier. Isaac glanced at his father from time to time, still trying to understand everything that had happened. He didn't ask questions, but his eyes said enough. There was respect there now, and something even deeper, faith. Abraham smiled faintly, knowing that his son had witnessed what few ever could. That true faith is not about understanding everything, but but about trusting even when nothing makes sense. Back at camp, Sarah saw them coming from afar. Her heart leapt when she saw Isaac alive, her laughter returning just as it had the day he was born. The family embraced, and for the first time in many years, the promise no longer felt distant. It was real, alive, walking beside them. Abraham's household grew, his name became known across lands, and people from far and wide spoke of the man who trusted God without question. As Abraham grew older, he often looked up at the stars again, the same ones he had once counted in hope. Now, he no longer counted them. He simply smiled, knowing that his descendants would one day be as countless as the light above him. The story of Abraham, the father of nations, was more than a story of one man's faith. It was a story of every human heart that has ever struggled to believe, to trust, and to hope. And as generations passed, Abraham's legacy lived on, a reminder that faith, though tested by time and trial, always leads to promise. His journey ended on that mountain, but his story would never fade. It would continue in the hearts of all who dare to believe that with faith, even the impossible becomes possible.